You know, it's funny to think back to a time when cars didn't even come with seatbelts, as a standard thing.
Right.
Or even when you would hesitate before, you would think twice about complaining about a faulty product. You'd be worried about some kind of corporate retaliation or something.
Oh, yeah.
Hard to believe that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
So today we're diving into this really pivotal era in American history, the rise of the consumer movement.
A real seismic cultural shift, I think. And you can't tell that story without talking about Ralph Nader,
Right.
this young lawyer who took on these giant corporations, these giants of industry.
Yeah.
And he really empowered everyday people like you to demand better, safer products.
Absolutely. And we've got a ton of great sources to unpack here today.
Yeah.
Articles, interviews, even clips from some congressional hearings.
Oh, wow.
All painting this really vivid picture of how this whole movement unfolded.
Yeah, it's so interesting how Nader really saw this systemic issue. I mean, it went way beyond these individual cases, right? He recognized that corporations were putting profit ahead of safety, time and time again.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to call them out on it.
And that's where his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, comes into play.
Right.
He took aim at the Chevrolet Corvair. I mean, this car was notorious for its handling problems and its tendency to roll over.
Yeah.
Now, a later government study actually disputed the idea that the Corvair was uniquely dangerous.
Okay.
But Nader's book, it really struck a chord with the public. It became a bestseller.
Huge.
And it really put the auto industry on the defensive.
They were not happy about it.
So General Motors, the company behind the Corvair, how did they react?
Well, how do you think they reacted? They tried to discredit him, of course.
Yeah.
Hired private investigators to dig up dirt on the guy. Even tried to set him up, in these compromising situations.
Remember this.
Trying to make him look bad.
Wow.
It all blew up in their faces, though.
How so?
Big time. So during a Senate hearing, this is incredible, Senator Ribicoff actually exposed GM's tactics, publicly called them out right there in the hearing.
Oh, my gosh.
It was humiliating for GM. The company's president had to issue this very public apology.
I bet.
The whole thing backfired spectacularly.
Wow. So what happened?
The public was outraged. I mean, not just by the safety issues with the cars, but by this blatant attempt to silence a critic.
Right.
And that outrage, that's what fueled the passage of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act in 1966.
Huge. I mean, think about the impact of that. This act actually forced the auto industry to meet federal safety standards for the first time.
Right.
It was a huge win for consumers and really a testament to the power of just speaking up.
And Nader didn't stop there. He saw a system that was stacked against the average person.
Yeah.
And he was determined to change it.
So what else did he go after?
Unsafe baby food, environmental pollution, you name it. He went after it all.
Wow.
Exposing corporate wrongdoing left and right, just pushing for greater accountability across the board.
He was relentless.
He built this network, too, of all these young, passionate activists and lawyers.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
Nicknamed Nader's Raiders.
Yeah.
And they went after everybody. Government agencies, corporations didn't matter.
Really taking on the whole system.
Trying to make a real difference.
So what kind of impact did they have?
I mean, their work led to some pretty landmark legislation. The Clean Air Act.
Huge.
The Clean Water Act. And the creation of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
These regulations are things that impact our lives every single day.
Exactly. They made a huge difference.
It's pretty incredible how much they accomplished in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, it really is.
But, sweeping changes like that, they're never going to go unchallenged.
Of course not.
Corporate interests felt threatened. And there was this powerful backlash brewing.
Oh, yeah. This is where we see the rise of this, coordinated counter movement.
Okay.
And it was spearheaded by people like Lewis Powell.
Who's that?
This guy, he later became a Supreme Court justice. But at the time, he wrote this confidential memo.
What was it about?
It was basically urging businesses to fight back against what he saw as this attack on the American free enterprise system.
Wow.
This document, it became known as the Powell Memo.
Okay.
And it really became a blueprint for the conservative movement's efforts to push back against regulation and consumer protection.
So you've got this incredible momentum for consumer rights.
Right.
This movement accomplished so much in just a few short years.
Yeah.
But the tide was starting to turn.
And a perfect storm was brewing. The country was dealing with all these economic problems, and there was this growing sentiment that, regulation was stifling business, hurting economic growth, and this shift in the narrative, it really set the stage for a new era of deregulation.
Oh, boy.
And that had profound consequences for the consumer movement.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the consumer movement, picking up where we left off.
Yeah, things are getting kind of dicey, weren't they? A bit, yeah. You know, this changing political landscape and this growing corporate counter movement.
Right. And then the 80s hit, and with it, Reaganomics and deregulation was the name of the game. And a lot of those hard-won consumer protections, they started to erode.
It's important to remember, though, that Reaganomics, you know, it wasn't inherently anti-consumer.
Right.
I mean, it encompassed this whole range of economic policies, you know, tax cuts, reduced government spending, and a real focus on these free market principles.
Right. The idea was that less regulation, more competitions, you know, businesses would thrive.
Exactly.
And ultimately, consumers would benefit.
Right, in theory.
But one of the articles we read pointed out that this approach kind of overlooked the power imbalances, you know, between corporations and individual consumers.
Yeah, I mean, deregulation in theory sounds great. Less red tape, more freedom for businesses to innovate.
Right.
But without these strong consumer protections in place, it can create this environment where corporations, they just prioritize profits over people.
And this is where the Powell memo really comes into play, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It laid out this whole strategy for corporate America to push back against regulation and really reshape public perception.
And in the 80s, we see those ideas really taking hold.
So what happened?
Well, corporate-funded think tanks, they started gaining a lot of influence. Lobbying efforts intensified. And this whole narrative emerged that painted consumer advocates as these, like, out-of-touch radicals.
Okay.
You know, they were hindering economic progress.
It's amazing how that messaging really resonated with people.
It is.
There was this growing distrust of government at the time.
Right.
And the idea of, you know, individual freedom and less regulation had a certain appeal.
It did. And meanwhile, Nader, he just kept fighting.
What was he up to?
Throughout the 80s and 90s, he continued to expose corporate wrongdoing, pushing for things like mandatory airbags, insurance rate rollbacks.
I mean, he was up against the tide of deregulation, though, right?
Oh, yeah, it was an uphill battle, for sure.
Yeah,
But even as the broader consumer movement kind of lost momentum,
right.
Nader's persistence is remarkable. He refused to be silenced, even as his voice became increasingly marginalized in the whole political discourse.
He never gave up?
Nope. And then comes the year 2000 and his very controversial decision to run for president.
Oh, yeah.
This is where his legacy takes a real complicated turn.
How so?
Well, Nader, he was convinced that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans truly represented the interests of everyday people. So he launched this independent campaign.
And that's what sparked all the outrage from the Democrats, right?
Yeah, a lot of them blamed him for siphoning off votes from Al Gore.
Right.
Which they say led to George W. Bush's victory.
Yeah.
They saw it as this betrayal of the very cause he had championed for so long.
I can see why they'd be upset.
Nader, though, he defended his decision.
What did he say?
He argued that he was giving a voice to those who felt disenfranchised by the two-party system. And to be fair, he did bring attention to issues that were often ignored in those mainstream political debates.
Yeah.
But the shadow of that 2000 election, it loomed large. It overshadowed his decades of work on behalf of consumers.
It's a good reminder of just how complex the political landscape is.
Definitely.
And how even the most well-intentioned actions can have these unforeseen consequences.
Nader's story is full of triumphs and setbacks, and it raises a lot of questions about the role of individual activism, the power of corporate interests, and the ebb and flow of public opinion.
So we've seen this incredible movement rise up.
We have.
The backlash it provoked.
Yeah.
The political events that really shaped its trajectory. So where do we go from here? What does all this mean for us today?
That's the question we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at Nader's lasting impact, the challenges facing consumer advocacy in the 21st century,
Right.
and what it might take to reignite a movement that once transformed American society.
So we've been on this journey exploring the consumer movement from its really powerful beginnings to, you know, kind of its struggles against this huge corporate counter movement.
Right.
So where does that leave us today? I mean, what's going on with consumer advocacy in the 21st century?
Well, it's a very interesting landscape. On the one hand, you see this resurgence of consumer activism.
Oh, yeah.
In recent years, driven by concerns about data privacy and climate change, corporate accountability, all that.
You see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Online campaigns, boycotts,
Yeah.
even shareholder activism.
Right. It seems like people are really demanding more transparency from companies
Yeah.
and more ethical practices from the companies that they support.
What I find so interesting is how this new wave of activism is often led by, younger generations.
Oh, absolutely.
They're so digitally savvy, globally connected, and they're using social media in such powerful ways
Yeah.
to organize and to really hold these corporations accountable.
It's like Nader's Raiders, but for the digital age.
Right, exactly. But the challenges they face now are even more complex than back then, I think.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we live in a world that's dominated by these tech giants,
Right.
global supply chains,
Right.
and just a constant flood of information. It can be really tough to cut through all the noise and, actually get people to care.
Yeah, and there's this, pervasive sense of cynicism and distrust. It's like, who do you believe?
Right.
What do you trust when you're constantly being bombarded by all this conflicting information?
Exactly, which is why I think critical thinking is more important now than ever.
Yeah.
We need to be able to, evaluate sources and recognize bias and figure out what's true and what's not.
It's like we need this whole new skill set
We do.
just to navigate the modern marketplace, not just to protect ourselves from faulty products,
Right.
but to protect ourselves from misinformation
Yeah.
and the erosion of our privacy.
It's a whole new ballgame.
So where does Nader's legacy fit into all of this?
I think it offers both inspiration and caution, He showed us what individuals can really accomplish.
Yeah.
He showed us how important it is to, speak truth to power and just never give up.
Right.
But his story also shows the risks of, being inflexible, the danger of alienating potential allies, and how difficult it is to sustain a movement over a really long period of time.
So looking back at the consumer movement,
Yeah.
the good and the bad, what can we learn from it all? I mean, what does it actually take to create meaningful change in today's world?
I think the most important thing to remember is that change is possible.
Okay.
Nader and his allies, they proved that.
They did.
But it takes real effort, strategic collaboration, and a willingness to adapt to a changing landscape.
So it's not about being this lone crusader.
No.
It's about building a movement that's diverse and inclusive and really responsive to the needs of everyday people.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that consumer advocacy isn't just about product safety or getting a good price. It's about making sure our voices are heard, that our rights are respected, and that our values are reflected in the marketplace.
I like that.
It's about holding corporations accountable.
Yeah.
Not just to their shareholders, but to their employees, the environment, the communities where they do business.
So bigger than just buying stuff.
Way bigger. It's about our power as consumers and citizens.
Yeah.
And using that power to create a better world.
A more just equitable world.
A sustainable world. All of that.
It's a good reminder that this fight, it's far from over.
Oh, yeah.
The story of the consumer movement.
Right.
It's this story of progress and setbacks, of victories and battles that are still going on.
And it's a story that each of us can be a part of.
That's a good point.
So the next time you see a company doing something shady or there's an issue that makes you mad, remember what Ralph Nader did. Remember that your voice matters and don't be afraid to speak up.
That's a great note to end on. So that wraps up our deep dive into the rise and fall of the consumer movement. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. You can find links to all the sources we discussed in the show notes. Thanks for joining us.